There's a lesson that Washington learns slowly, but forgets very quickly. And the lesson's this: that voters, that you, are paying attention. Not to everything, and not all the time, but when the gap between what a politician says and what a politician does becomes large enough, when the money trail becomes obvious enough, voters notice. And when they notice, they act. Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana noticed that this past Saturday on May 16th, when he stood before his supporters in Baton Rouge and he conceded the Republican primary for the U.S. Senate seat. He's the incumbent, and he came in third. In his own state, in his own backyard, in his own party, behind a challenger backed by President Trump. The chairman of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee, the most powerful health legislative seat in the United States Senate, was sent home. And the reason that this matters to this show has nothing to do with his vote on impeachment against President Trump almost 6 years ago. It has nothing to do with Trump loyalty politics. And it has nothing to do with the internal Republican feuds that have dominated the political news coverage across this country and of that race. It has everything to do with a simple and increasingly unavoidable truth that you cannot credibly claim to hold Big Pharma accountable while actively protecting Big Pharma's most profitable arrangements. Because when voters find out that that's exactly what you've been doing, when the money trail becomes part of your story, you will lose. Not just the argument, but the seat. And that is what happened to Bill Cassidy. And it's a warning sign that every member of Congress sitting on pharmaceutical contributions while stalling drug pricing reform should be reading very carefully right now. Today, we're going to talk about accountability. We're going to talk about political accountability, legislative accountability, and the specific arguments that the pharmaceutical industry is using right now to prevent both. Arguments that deserve to be answered directly on their merits once and for all. Welcome back to Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess. And I want to start with the political reality as it stands today, because I think it has ultimately shifted in a way that Washington has not fully absorbed yet. 89% of Republican voters support codifying most favored nation drug pricing into law. 74% of all voters hold a negative opinion of pharmaceutical companies. President Trump ran on lowering drug prices and has made it a centerpiece of his domestic agenda. The White House Council of Economic Advisors has projected $600 billion in savings for patients with full MFN implementation. Those numbers describe a political environment in which opposing drug pricing reform is not a defensible position. It's not a position you can survive in a Republican primary. It's not a position you can defend to your constituents. It is a position you can maintain only as long as the money funding your campaign is louder than the voters watching what you do with their health care. Bill Cassidy maintained that position for as long as he could. He took more than $1 million from Big Pharma during his Senate career. He was the top Republican recipient of pharmaceutical money in the 2024 cycle, from an industry that he was simultaneously positioned to help regulate as the chairman of the HELP Committee. He voted against Medicare drug pricing negotiation. He blocked a fast-track MFN vote on the Senate floor. He circulated a draft codification bill that Big Pharma killed before it ever received a hearing in his own committee. And then the voters of Louisiana, in a Republican Party primary, decided it was time for him to come home. That's the lesson. Protecting Big Pharma has a political price. That price is now being collected by the American people. But here's what I want to spend this episode on, because the Cassidy story is not the whole story. Bill Cassidy's gone. The industry that paid him is not. And right now, today, that industry is running the same arguments it has always run, though it's coming from different mouths and through different checkbooks. They are trying to preserve the same arguments that Bill Cassidy has protected for years. And we're going to take those arguments apart today, one by one. The pharmaceutical industry's oldest and most durable argument is the innovation argument. We hear it again and again and again, and we'll hear it again before this year is out. We will probably even hear it this week. And it goes something like this. America leads the world in medicine development. That leadership depends on the pricing environment that funds research. Weakening that environment through drug pricing reform, and all we will be doing is jeopardizing the breakthroughs that American patients and eventually global patients depend on. I mean, it's a powerful argument. It's worked in Washington for decades. And I want to give it a genuine hearing right here on this show right now before I dismantle it, because this show will always hold itself to that high of a standard. But there's something true inside of that argument. Drug development is genuinely hard. The failure rate is genuinely high. A regulatory and a commercial environment that rewards successful innovation is genuinely preferable to one that doesn't. The patent system, which you've heard me talk about ad nauseum, the patent system, which grants temporary exclusivity in exchange for public disclosure of the invention, is a legitimate policy tool with a legitimate rationale. Innovation is worth encouraging. Now, here is what the 2025 financial record says about whether the current pricing environment actually produces innovation. The 16 largest pharmaceutical companies cut their combined research and development spending by almost $6 billion last year. The steepest single company cut went down 29%. In that same year, that same company gave their CEO a 75% raise. We've talked about this on a previous episode. Time and time again, Big Pharma is slashing R&D, but increasing executive compensation. In 2025, Big Pharma also spent $9 billion on direct-to-consumer advertising. They returned $97 billion back to shareholders, and they spent $34 billion buying back their own stock. And they paid their top executives more than $500 million in combined compensation. Oh, and before we forget, they also spent over $450 million lobbying Congress to make sure that none of it had to change. I'm sorry, but spare me the lecture on innovation. That is not a spending pattern of an industry fighting to cure disease. It's the spending pattern of an industry fighting to protect a price gouging system, one that happens to have dressed itself up in the language of scientific progress for so long that Washington just simply stopped checking to see if those clothes actually fit. The innovation argument requires very specific math. It requires that high prices generate revenue that flow into research that produces breakthroughs that justify price. In 2025, the industry cut research, kept prices high, and sent the difference to shareholders and executives. But guess what? The American people know how to do math. You know how to do math. And you can tell that the math doesn't add up. Behind the innovation argument is a sleight of hand that the pharmaceutical industry has been running for decades, and I think it deserves to be named precisely. The industry wants you to believe that supporting the patent system and supporting their specific monopoly pricing strategy are the same thing, that it's the same position. The truth is that they're not. They are two entirely different things. And the pharmaceutical industry has spent decades and billions of dollars conflating the two, hoping that you don't notice the difference. Here's what the patent system was actually designed to do. Grant a temporary period of market exclusivity to inventors. A defined window, simply to recoup investment, in exchange for public disclosure of the innovation. When that window closed, the knowledge is public, competition enters, prices fall, and ultimately, in this case, patients would benefit. That's the entire deal. Lock, stock, and barrel. The inventor gets a period of exclusivity, and the public gets the knowledge and eventually the fair price market competition. The second half of that deal, though, the part where competition arrives and prices fall, is the part that pharmaceutical companies hate and that they've decided to treat as optional. We've documented this in several podcasts in the past. Patent thickets are real things that Big Pharma has created, and they are surrounding these thickets around single drugs with hundreds of secondary patents. They utilize pay-for-delay settlements that pay generic manufacturers to stay out of the market. They product hop that shifts patients from minimally modified versions of expiring drugs. These evergreening strategies extend exclusivity. And 9 times out of 10, it's with FDA-approved generics simply sitting on the shelf the entire time. Every one of those strategies is an attempt to prevent the second half of the patent bargain from happening. It's to take away your ability to have free market competition. By taking the exclusivity that the system granted as temporary and making it permanent, Big Pharma is trying to swindle you. And they do so by using lawyers and lobbyists and secondary filings to ensure that the moment Americans were promised, the moment when competition is supposed to arrive and that the price is supposed to fall, that it will never come. That's not the patent system. That's the patent system being hijacked. That's modern day piracy. And here is the political point that follows directly from that distinction. Any legislator, any member of Congress who supports the patent system, who believes in rewarding genuine innovation with a fair exclusivity window, is not obligated to support every legal maneuver that Big Pharma deploys to extend their exclusivity window indefinitely. Those aren't the same position. Conflating them is how the industry has kept reform-minded legislators on defense for 30 years. Well, it stops now. Supporting most favored nation codification is not an attack on the patent system. I don't care what Big Pharma says. It is an insistence that the patent bargain be honored, that the exclusivity window be temporary, and that competition finally arrive. Because guess what? American patients will get better pricing. Pricing that reflects something other than what a captive market will bear. That argument needs to be made loudly, and we're trying to do it on this show, but it takes more. And guess what else it takes? It takes legislators who understand that their job is to make it louder. Now, I want to talk about an argument that has gained significant traction in Washington over the course of the last year and a half or 2 years. Because it's clever. It might be one of the most clever things Big Pharma has done in a while. What they're doing is they're wrapping the industry's pricing protection in the flag. And it puts it on a terrain where skeptics of the industry are suddenly put on the defensive. The argument is the China argument. And it goes a lot like this. China is catching up in pharmaceutical development. American leadership in biopharmaceutical innovation is at risk. Weakening the pricing environment through drug pricing reform would accelerate America's competitive decline relative to China's. To protect American security, sovereignty, and American innovation, Congress must protect the current pricing arrangement. I mean, wow. If I hadn't been studying this issue for almost 4 years, if I wasn't as smart as you listening to this program right now, I might actually be convinced that they're right. But they're not. In 2024, the pharmaceutical industry spent $137 billion on research and development in China. $137 billion. Not in Boston, not in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, not in San Diego or Houston or the Bay Area, but in China, communist China. The same country the industry is now warning Congress about in its lobbying against drug pricing reform. I'm going to take a minute and let that sit with you. Take your time. Big Pharma is standing in the halls of Congress warning legislators that Chinese competition threatens American pharmaceutical leadership while simultaneously writing checks worth $137 billion to fund pharmaceutical development inside of China. Big Pharma is not worried about Chinese pharmaceutical competition. Big Pharma is funding that competition while telling Congress that holding them accountable to the American consumer is what threatens American leadership. The hypocrisy is not subtle. The strategy is not complicated. It's the same strategy the industry has always used. Find the argument that puts reform on the wrong side of something that Americans care about. In the 90s, it was AIDS research. In the early 2000s, it was the war on cancer. Today, it's China. The specific fear changes. The function is identical, though. Make drug pricing reform look like a threat to something important. So the important thing absorbs the political heat that should be landing squarely on the industry's pricing practices. Any member of Congress who falls for the China argument while the industry is simultaneously spending $137 billion funding Chinese pharmaceutical developments deserve every bit of the political price that they will pay for it. The voters of Louisiana just showed what that price looks like. Somebody should call Bill Cassidy and ask him what he's going to be doing next January. Because I'll tell you what, it's not going to be taking the oath of office for another term in the 120th Congress. Now, there's a cousin to the China argument that we need to address separately because it runs on a different track and it requires a different answer. It's the supply chain security argument. And this one goes a little bit different. It's not relying on other countries for our medicines keeps Americans safe. Drug pricing reform could undermine domestic manufacturing investment. And so to protect the American pharmaceutical supply chain, we need to protect the American pharmaceutical pricing environment. That argument has a little bit of truth inside of it. American dependence on foreign active pharmaceutical ingredients, the raw chemical components of prescription drugs, is a genuine national security concern. We've documented it. This is in context of the tariff conversation that we had earlier this year. The concentration of API manufacturing in China and India creates real vulnerabilities for our national security infrastructure. A disruption in that supply chain would have real consequences for American patients. But here's the problem. The pharmaceutical industry that is now lecturing Congress about supply chain security is the same industry that spent the last 40 years building up that dependence. Seriously, look at where your prescription was actually made. Look at where its raw ingredients were actually sourced. The active pharmaceutical ingredients for drugs sold in America at the highest prices in the developed world were in enormous proportions manufactured overseas. Not because the government forced the industry offshore, because offshoring production to cheaper manufacturing environments while maintaining American prices maximizes their margin. The industry made that calculation deliberately over decades for nothing more than profit. Now, the same industry is in Washington arguing that you must protect their pricing power in order to protect the supply chain security that they themselves compromised. Lower drug prices do not weaken American supply chain security. a pharmaceutical industry that has spent 40 years moving production overseas while charging Americans premium prices for the privilege. That is what has weakened American supply chain security. And the executives responsible for those decisions are the very last people on earth Congress should be taking supply chain lectures from. Drug pricing and supply chain security are two separate conversations. The industry has kept them tangled together for one reason. The moment you untangle them, both arguments collapse. Lower prices are compatible with domestic manufacturing investments. The government can incentivize domestic API production directly through the tariff framework the president has already deployed without preserving monopoly pricing for drugs that Americans currently pay 3 times the international rate for. The tangled argument is a lobbying strategy by Big Pharma. It's not a policy position, and we shouldn't think of it as such. So the argument that the industry saves for last, the one they deploy when the innovation argument has failed or stumbled, and the China argument has failed or stumbled, and the supply chain argument has failed or stumbled. The argument they fall back on when they need to make drug pricing reform sound un-American. It's the price control argument. Codifying most favored nation drug pricing into law, they say, would import socialized price controls into the United States. It's the language of the left. It is what they do in Europe. It is incompatible with the American free market tradition. I'm sorry, but the conservative voters aren't buying it, and neither is President Donald J. Trump, and neither should the 119th Congress. This is what most favored nation pricing actually does. It's one simple thing. It says that Americans, the best customers the pharmaceutical industry has in the world, the population that pays the highest prices, the market that subsidizes every other market, should not pay more than the lowest price the industry already willingly accepts from another developed nation. That's not socialism. That is not price control in any meaningful sense of the term. It is the most basic principle of fair dealing in commerce. You do not get to charge your best customer the worst price. You do not get to tell the people who have supported your business longest and most loyally that they must pay 3 times what you charge everyone else for the exact same drug, made in the exact same factory, by the exact same company. For decades, that is exactly what Big Pharma has done to the American people. Americans pay more than 3 times what citizens of other wealthy countries pay for the same medication. Not because the drugs are better here, not because the service is better, not because the research was funded exclusively by American patients, although American taxpayers do fund an enormous share of the basic research through NIH that underlies the industry's most profitable drugs. But because Americans for 30 plus years have had a Congress unwilling to tell the industry no. The industry calls most favored nation pricing a price control. I call it a negotiation. I'm sure the president agrees with me. The kind every other purchaser in the world has been conducting with Big Pharma for decades while American patients were left to pay whatever the manufacturer decided to charge. The only thing standing between American patients and the relief that they've been demanding is the lobbying machine of the very industry that has been overcharging them. At $452 million a year, that's 3 lobbyists for every member of Congress. Big Pharma's lobbying machine is powerful, but it's just watched one of the most valuable Senate assets they have lose a Republican primary in his home state. Guess what? The machine is not invincible. And the members of Congress who have been hiding behind its arguments need to understand that. I want to spend some time talking about TrumpRx because the platform's expansion this past week is genuinely significant for a specific population. And because the distinction between what TrumpRx is and what most favored nation pricing codification is matters enormously to understanding where the fight actually stands with Big Pharma. The expansion of TrumpRx adds more than 600 generic medications to the platform through multiple different avenues. The site now lists hundreds of commonly prescribed generic medications, many priced at $5 or less. For the uninsured patient, the cash paying patient, the patient in that high deductible plan who hasn't yet met their deductible, this is a meaningful, real improvement. These prices that have been made available are now visible on a government-endorsed platform through one unified search. But I want to be precise about what TrumpRx is and what it's not. Because the industry, Big Pharma, has made a very deliberate peace with TrumpRx. And understanding why is going to tell you where the real fight is. TrumpRx is a cash pay portal. It doesn't integrate with insurance. Purchases made through TrumpRx don't count towards your deductible or your out-of-pocket maximum. For an insured patient, it means paying entirely out of pocket on a parallel track while your insurance benefits go unused. The Kaiser Family Foundation's analysis found that a patient with a $35 insurance copay on a drug could pay $100 through TrumpRx for that same medication. TrumpRx for that specific patient costs 3 times as much than their insurance coverage. Approximately 85% of Americans have prescription drug insurance. The prices governing their daily reality, the list prices, the formulary structures, the prior authorization requirements, TrumpRx doesn't touch those. And the Kaiser Family Foundation found that only 7% of regular prescription drug users visited the TrumpRx site in its first month after launch. Here is what that tells you about the industry's calculation. They signed on to TrumpRx. They show up at the White House and they stand next to the president during these events. They list their discounts. They cooperate with the platform. And then days later, they raise the price on 872 drugs. TrumpRx serves a real population and provides real relief to that population. The industry cooperates with it because it costs them almost nothing. It is a separate channel for a minority of patients that doesn't threaten the pricing architecture governing the majority of patients. Here's where codification of most favored nation pricing enters the conversation. Because codification is what threatens that pricing architecture. It's a law with teeth, with penalties, with coverage that extends to insured patients, that doesn't expire with the tariff environment. TrumpRx is a concession the industry makes at the checkout counter. MFN codification is the bill they are spending $450 million a year to prevent from ever coming due. So let's go back to now the empty chair at the Help Committee. Illegitimately, it's not empty yet. Bill Cassidy gets to finish out his term. He'll be done at the end of December. But it means that his chairmanship is now empty. And the empty chair being left behind by Bill Cassidy's defeat is not a symbolic vacancy. It's a structural one. The Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee is where MFN codification legislation must originate. It is where drug pricing bills are written, marked up, and advanced to the Senate floor. Whoever chairs that committee determines whether the president's drug pricing agenda becomes permanent law or remains a voluntary program that the industry has already demonstrated it can route around. The lesson of Bill Cassidy's defeat is not only that he was punished for his relationship with the pharmaceutical industry, it is that the voters are now sophisticated enough to connect where the money comes from. When they hear that a senator took millions of dollars from a pharmaceutical company and then blocked the fast-track MFN vote, they can do that math. And they did. Every single member of Congress now considering their position on most favored nation pricing codification should be doing the same math in their own head. The industry, Big Pharma, will spend whatever it takes to protect the next chairman of the Help Committee, in the exact same way that it protected Bill Cassidy. They'll write checks. They'll deploy its 3 lobbyists per member ratio. It will bring the 4 arguments that we've addressed here today: innovations, patents, China, socialism, and it will bring it with the backing of $450 million in annual lobbying spending. But what the reform movement has is a different kind of math. 89% of Republican voters, the president standing up in the well of the United States House of Representatives during the State of the Union and calling for codification, a White House projection of $600 billion in patient savings, and now a recent, visible, documented example of what happens to a United States senator who protected the industry while that support was being built, while ignoring the desires of his voters. The industry's math has always been about money, but the reform movement's math is about votes. And votes won a few Saturdays ago. I'm going to be clear about what kind of argument I'm making in this episode, because I know that the territory looks different from a distance, and that it's kind of a critique that you might hear from the left. But it's not. The conservative case for drug pricing accountability rests on 3 pillars. First, markets work when they are actually competitive. The pharmaceutical market, with its government-granted patent monopolies, its lobby-protected exclusivity extensions, its pay-for-delay settlements, and its patent thickets, is not competitive. It is a managed extraction system built on the foundation of a government privilege, the patent grant, that was intended to be temporary. Protecting that system is not defending capitalism. It is defending cronyism. Those are not the same thing. A conservative who cannot tell the difference between a free market and a captured one is not defending conservative principles. They are defending industry that wrote them a check. Second, the America First agenda includes American patients. The president has made that explicitly clear. Lower drug prices, most favored nation pricing codification, transparency in pharmaceutical pricing, these are the items on the president's domestic agenda. A Republican member of Congress who opposes that agenda while taking Big Pharma's money is not a conservative defending markets. They are an industry employee with an honorable title in the United States House of Representatives or the United States Senate. The voters of Louisiana just demonstrated that they can tell the difference. And I guarantee you that the voters in 49 other states can too. Third, accountability is a conservative value. The pharmaceutical industry has operated for decades with effective immunity from the accountability that every other sector of the American economy faces. It is hidden behind the innovation argument, the China argument, the supply chain argument, and the price controlling argument. It has deployed those arguments through $450 million in annual lobbying, 3 lobbyists for every 1 member of Congress, and coordinated CEO contributions to the chairman of relevant Senate committees. The conservative response to that is not deference. It is accountability enforced through law, and it starts with most favored nation pricing codification. That is what this show has argued for since the beginning. That is what the president is fighting for since he retook office. That is what 89% of Republican voters say they want. And that is what the next Help Committee chairman needs to deliver. There's a version of this story that Washington wants to tell itself. In that version, Cassidy lost because of the impeachment vote. TrumpRx is the greatest breakthrough in healthcare cost reduction in modern history. The pharmaceutical industry's arguments about innovation in China and supply chain security and price controls deserve serious consideration from serious legislators. But you and I know better. And so let me offer a different version. Bill Cassidy lost because voters in a Republican primary connected the money to the outcome. Because they understood, without receiving a briefing, without receiving a policy paper, without a show like this one explaining it to them, that a United States senator who takes millions of dollars from pharmaceutical companies and then blocks drug pricing reform is not representing his constituents. He's representing his contributors. And they decided to vote accordingly. TrumpRx is a real tool for a real population. It's not the greatest breakthrough in healthcare cost reduction in modern history, but it's a great step forward. It is a cash pay portal that serves approximately 15% of the market, while the industry that cooperates with it raises prices on 872 drugs. And the industry's arguments about innovation in China and supply chain and pricing controls are lobbying strategies dressed up as policy positions. They don't hold up. The clothes don't fit. What does hold up is this. American patients pay more than 3 times what patients in other wealthy countries pay for the same drugs. 1 in 4 Americans can't fill their prescriptions that their doctors write them. 89% of Republican voters want that to change. The president has called for codification of most favored nation pricing, and the White House has projected $600 billion in savings for American patients. The only thing standing between those patients and that relief? Big Pharma. The other Saturday night, one of those legislators went home who relied on Big Pharma rather than relying on his constituents. The Big Pharma machine is still running. The fight's not over. But the direction of the fight has changed. And this show is going to keep making sure you know exactly what it costs, politically, financially, and morally, if you stand on the wrong side of this issue. This is Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess. We'll be back next week.